I'm going to introduce our next speaker this morning. So Alex Sawatzky is an interdisciplinary researcher and artist. Alex brings a unique blend of expertise in her role as the creative advisor at the Arel Food Institute, where she provides guidance and support to the creative components of the Arel Food Institute and Food from Thought projects. Guided by a commitment to collaboration and community-driven approaches, Alex works at the intersection of research, art, and design, fostering relationships that co-create and mobilize knowledge. Alex holds a PhD in public health from the University of Guelph, where she worked in partnership with a larger team to develop and strengthen place-based, Inuit-led climate change adaptation initiatives. And this experience laid the foundation for her commitment to collaborative, intersectional approaches in research and knowledge mobilization. So I'm very happy to have you, Alex, and thanks for coming back with us today.
Thanks so much. The true delight to be here. I see some familiar faces who may have seen versions of this presentation before, so hopefully there's something new you can glean from this, and for everyone else, hopefully there's something again, new you can glean from all of this. So this workshop, more of a presentation with a lot of examples and some opportunities for questions and discussion, all about infographics as tools for getting research into practice. So whether it's a true infographic or an infographic style poster, essentially using design considerations to help make your research accessible, relatable, and actionable for people. So I don't have to reintroduce myself. I'm Alex, and I have a background in both art and research, and often the two intersect in my work today. And before I begin, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, recognizing the lands from which we are all learning and sharing knowledge on. This is really important, I feel, in the field of knowledge mobilization specifically, when we're thinking about whose knowledge we're sharing, who we're sharing it to, and really recognizing our own identities and what we're bringing to those relationships. So I encourage you all to just reflect a little bit on where you're coming from and what you're bringing into this workshop. And into your research in general, and situating yourself within that kind of knowledge relationship. That's something to kind of carry through the entire research process. This workshop, again, is a version of a couple I've done before based on the Infographics in Practice program, and I'll be sharing actually a few examples of that program or what came out of that program later in the slides. We did this back in the fall. It was a collaboration between a few different offices across campus, and it ended up being a great success, and there's a lot of interest in adapting this workshop to different contexts too, so I'm excited to apply it to this one today. Some specific goals that I'm hoping to touch on are essentially just learning some promising practices for designing infographics and infographic style posters to help get your research into practice. First, understanding strategies for identifying your key messages and audiences, aligning your message with your audience, because that will likely shift depending on what your audience, who your audience is. And then moving into understanding some basic design principles that will help you align your message and really make sure it gets to that target audience in the right way. And then selecting and applying those design principles strategically. This is something that's an ongoing practice for me too. Often I learn every time I do a project, and it can be a little bit frustrating, but it's also very illuminating in terms of how much I don't know and how much I still have to learn. So this is only the beginning, and this is not meant to be a all-in-one, like this is how you do it, but this is hopefully a starting point to start thinking about. I'll start with an overview of knowledge mobilization principles. Many of you will be familiar with this or related terms, and then move into talking about infographics specifically as tools for getting research into practice under that umbrella, knowledge mobilization. And then go through quickly some strategies for identifying some key messages that you can use to guide the design of an infographic, and likewise your target audiences as well. And then Probably the bulk of the talk will be about the design considerations and going through some examples at the end. And I will be leaving you with some resources that I'll share afterwards to send out to folks. So first, who here is familiar with knowledge mobilization, knowledge transfer, knowledge extension? Yes, okay, so a few hands are going up. It's essentially a broad term that is used when we talk about research impact, describes all the things that we do to get knowledge into the hands of people to create solutions, take actions, and make decisions. It's about making your data and information useful and sharing that information with people in a way that they can apply it. So I said a lot of things that are actually just saying the same thing. It's transforming knowledge into action. And in this way, KMB is equivalent to GRIP, getting research into practice, which some of you also may be familiar with. That's about translating research findings into practical applications, specifically for the livestock industry. Knowledge mobilization does the same thing, but it's a broader term that's used across disciplines. And for both, the best strategies for, well, there's not really one right strategy, but the best ones will depend on your message and your audience and what you're hoping the impact will be. So backing up a little bit, where do we get the knowledge that we're mobilizing or sharing? That starts with data. Data are words, numbers, images, and specific facts. Often it's raw, there's no context, and there's no immediate way to identify patterns. So think about just like a large spreadsheet or just like a pile of interviews. Like there's no real method to that madness at that point. Through processing data, that's where we get to information. So information serves a purpose. It has a little bit more meaning and answers some questions such as who, what, where, how many, etc. And in that way, it provides some context and framing to the data. So it requires a little bit of work to get to that stage. And next, through processing information and through making strategic decisions about how to share it, that's when we get to knowledge. So that's contextualized, learning, reasoning, and understanding, and helps to build relationships and build connections with the knowledge or information that's being shared, and helps to inform decision-making and action. So hopefully that flow makes sense. So when you're designing a poster, you're starting with your research data, you're processing it, you're organizing it, you're getting it into an information situation where you have some framing, and then the poster itself will be that contextualized learning, that way of sharing that knowledge. Because this is a talk on infographics, this is a visual way of maybe understanding some of that. So thinking about data as an unsorted pile of Lego bricks, there's no real pattern there yet. You can sort them, you can arrange them, you can get to a little bit, okay, there's this many yellow, this many red, you have some more information about the data you're working with. But until you have the roadmap or the guideline for building that diorama, you don't really have the knowledge about what to do with it. So you're moving through those different stages and getting to a place where you can explain what you have in front of you with a story. And that's a good segue into talking about infographics as tools for getting research into practice. That fully built Lego structure is a metaphor for an infographic, and infographics can help accelerate GRIP and knowledge mobilization by making complex research and data accessible to industry professionals and policymakers and farmers and other audiences as well. But first, what are infographics and why are they so effective? Well, first, a lot of us, at least to some degree, are visual learners. We take visual cues from what is in front of us. And we're also quite busy as grad students, and a few undergrad students here today. There's a lot going on, and to be tasked with interpreting and analyzing and making decisions off of like large pieces of information, that's a lot to expect from someone, especially if you're not a professional in that area, or that's not your area of expertise, but you're required to access it for your work or a decision or something like that. So a visual tool in that way can help expedite that process and get you to a place where it's like, okay, I have some understanding now of where this information is coming from and where I might want it to go to. So there's two components. They have the info component, that's the information you're working with, and then you have the graphic component. And together, that's where the knowledge building comes in, where you unite those two concepts. So there's lots of different approaches to infographics. Some are more like data-driven than others. We'll get into some examples later. But when you're looking at a poster and trying to determine whether or not it's an infographic or just a typical poster, asking yourself those questions of like, okay, is it telling me a story? Is it presenting the data, the information in a visually engaging way? That's probably leaning more towards the side of an infographic rather than a traditional research poster, which kind of just reads like a research paper, right? You have your introduction, your methods, your discussion and conclusion. So infographics kind of take that and find the story within the research and try to tell it in a little bit more of an engaging way. With that framing, so infographics are doing that work of processing data and information. They're not just pretty graphic designs. Sometimes they look pretty, but that aesthetic appeal doesn't really, if it's only aesthetically appealing and not giving you the information you need to make a decision, it's not really an effective infographic. So hopefully that is reassuring to any of you who may be varying confidence in design skills. You don't have to be a designer to design an effective infographic. In the work that I do, it's often my research background that I'm drawing on more than my design background when I'm designing science communication materials, just to have that additional context and way of asking questions and designing something that's effective. So a lot of different skill sets go into designing something that can be an effective communication tool. I like to think about infographics as telling a visual story. So not getting too much in the weeds at first, it's like more just stepping back and thinking like, what story do I want to tell with this data and information? Helping to get people to maybe think about it from different perspectives, and absorbing the information in a different way than maybe they're used to, like maybe a nonlinear way or like a different angle than what they're familiar with. I also, in my work, really think that this is most effective when it's premised on strong relationships, both with the material and with any collaborators you're working with or the audiences you're working with too. Really knowing your audience and knowing your material and building that strong relationship with it will only help to strengthen the final product. This is just a quick chart laying out some of the differences between more of like traditional research posters that you might be familiar with and more grip-oriented infographics that are more tailored to knowledge mobilization strategies. So comparing a traditional research poster, which is more text-heavy and has more detail on your methods, an infographic that's oriented towards getting research into practice is more concise, highlights the key message right away, and is like, this I'll touch on again and again. It should be very clear about what the intention of this infographic is. Also, going back to the left-hand side, traditional posters usually assume discipline-specific knowledge, whereas grip-oriented infographics, they could be designed for broader audiences, but as I'll get into later, sometimes it's more effective when it's very, very specifically targeted. But that targeted audience might not be the audience that has the discipline-specific knowledge, if that makes sense. So they might be farmers who work with a specific type of like soil management strategy, but they're not soil scientists, but you want to translate that information and make sure it's accessible to people to make decisions. Back to the traditional research poster, that's where you get typically it's a more linear and static design. And whereas infographics are more visually there's a story there. They can be data driven and engaging. And then back towards traditional research posters, mainly academic settings, whereas grip-oriented infographics are meant to be shared beyond academia. So I should emphasize too that this isn't a pros and cons thing. They're not better or worse than each other. It's more like if you're wanting to design something that is not a traditional research poster, these are the key distinguishing factors to consider as you're designing that. First, are there any questions about differences, similarities between types of posters? I think so. Yeah. I mean, I've never said no to a request to design one, depending on the based on the topic. So it's more like the research topic itself, I think you could design an infographic for, but it just matters about the context, if that makes sense. So maybe an infographic could be done for a specific research topic, but it's not the right like venue for it, if that makes sense. So I think like every time I'm up against like this seems a little bit too out of my comfort zone or whatever, that's when I start just asking more questions about, okay, like what is the intention for sharing this research? How can we do it in the best way? It's a really long answer, but hopefully that's giving you some reassurance that I think it's possible to do it regardless of research topic. And if you have any specific questions about specific research topics or areas, I'd be happy to chat more later. Any other questions? Key messages. Some of you may be familiar with these pointers already, but just to reiterate and emphasize some of the kind of key strategies for identifying your key message. You really want to make it obvious right away. You don't want to bury the lead. You also want to resist the urge to have maybe too many key messages. That can add some confusion in terms of like, well, what is this infographic trying to tell me? Your key message should also emphasize why someone should care about what you're sharing with them. And in that way, maybe inspire a call to action and prioritizing that over just like fun facts. Like that's great and entertaining, but in terms of taking action and making decisions based on evidence, facts only get you so far, and contextualizing them and applying them is kind of that next step to think about. Also, thinking about avoiding those kinds of like everything you know about this is wrong statements. Those can be catchy and grab attention, but it also implies that your audience is coming to that poster misinformed and not knowledgeable. So I like to avoid shaming and prioritize multiple types of knowledge that's coming together, and approaching your audience with dignity and recognizing that they're bringing a specific type of knowledge and experience to the conversation, the visual conversation. So if you're at an industry event with a lot of industry professionals, farmers, whatever, and you're talking about livestock management strategies, you don't want to tell them that what they've been doing is wrong, because that can be offensive and maybe halt the conversation. So just little things like that can be much more effective in building a relationship and building awareness and eventually informing action and decision making. Some strategies for identifying some key messages include asking yourself questions at the very beginning. Stepping back from even thinking about a poster or infographic at that point and asking, why did you pursue this topic in the first place? Maybe your supervisor told you to, well, then why did they pursue this research topic in the first place? And then also, what was the initial state of the environment or context before you started? So where are the problem or issues or actions you're responding to with your research? And then how did you solve that? And what did you learn along the way? So I like to start just kind of like writing those out, pen and paper, not really getting concerned with design just yet, but just trying to get myself in that headspace of like, why am I designing this thing? And what is it going to say? And hopefully that'll lead you to like refining all of the research and context that you've been working within to identify a key message. Similarly, for your target audience, asking questions at the beginning, thinking about who can benefit from the knowledge that you're going to be sharing through a poster or an infographic, and also how, not only how can they benefit or who can benefit, but who can act on it. Who's the most impactful kind, if it's research that's supposed to be informing a policy decision, what audiences are you going to try to reach to inform that decision? And then similarly for your target audience, as in your key message, why should they care? Really making sure that that's clear within the entire intent and process of your design. And then being specific as possible, like I said earlier, trying to reach everyone with one thing also sometimes reaches no one in particular because it doesn't really resonate with anyone. It just kind of like a bland, like, oh, this is interesting information, but it doesn't really concern me. So in the past, sometimes projects I've worked on, sometimes that means designing a series of different posters or visual materials, one for each audience. Sometimes different languages. So that requires collaborating with a lot of translators and things like that. But essentially thinking about your poster as part of a larger knowledge mobilization strategy or approach and not the be all end all. And really just helping yourself get clear on like what the purpose of it is and what your message is and what your audience is, and then being able to check those boxes at the end. So setting reasonable expectations, I guess, for yourself and your poster. Some strategies for designing that resonate. While I'm asking myself those questions about my key message to identify that, I also ask, what does your audience or this audience already know? So what can I avoid? What do I not have to include? What might be redundant? They might already know certain definitions or jargon. I don't have to worry about including that because it would just take up space and maybe seem like patronizing. So, and what do they need to know similarly? So if it's a scientific term that is really important for the context of the poster, designing or making sure that that definition is very clear. And also what messaging and vocabulary are most appropriate. So not trying to dumb it down. Again, approaching your audience with dignity and making your language clear and not simple. There's a whole other workshop on clear communication, but that's essentially just making sure that you're still getting your message across, but it's not in a very technical, jargony way. And also potential barriers to accessing that knowledge are important to consider as well, whether that's physical, intellectual, or like just disciplinary barriers, like where are they getting that knowledge from? So thinking about all those pieces, and you might not have all the answers at the beginning, but that's okay, just as long as you're getting yourself in that mindset and starting to consider the context within which you're designing your poster. So some examples from the past work I've done, just emphasizing how different audiences have different needs. This is an example of presenting information in familiar formats, new information in familiar formats. So this was a graphic I designed for an intergovernmental panel on climate change chapter. The propeller concept, the 3 bands, was familiar to that audience of predominantly natural scientists. This kind of approach was used in other chapters that were more natural science based, but this chapter was about mental health and climate change, and which is what was a relatively newer concept to folks working on climate change research. And we wanted to present it in a way that would be familiar. So the context would be approachable, but the information was new. So it just kind of helps open that door to having a conversation about a potentially new or unfamiliar topic. And this is a directory of programs and services in the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. So they wanted a directory that their service professionals could use as a guide or a map for clients. But they didn't want it in like a booklet format. They wanted it in a poster that they could have in offices around town and be able to easily identify the different services that might be appropriate for each client. So for us, it might not be intuitive, but for them, the concept of a tree with rings representing the different generations of people who might be accessing services was the starting point. And then the services were all mapped within those generational rings. And we used a legend at the bottom. You won't be able to see it from here, but they each icon indicates a different element of that program or service. So there's land-based programming elements, physical and clinical health, mental well-being, cultural well-being. And then I took those icons and mapped them to each of the program or service. So they could be like, okay, this person is looking for adult programming and they want some cultural well-being elements of it. So they're probably going to want to like learn more about the Adult Learning Center. So again, it's a way of like for certain audiences, this would be like, what am I looking at? But for this specific audience, this was exactly what they wanted. So just an example. Before we go into design considerations, I'm going to pause again and ask if anyone has questions about key messages, audiences, or anything I've talked about so far. Chris?
Question.
Yeah.
You say not to say everything that you know is wrong about something, but rather like highlighting your audience's base knowledge.
Yeah.
What kind of slogan would you use that highlights their base knowledge and like dumbing it down?
I like the terms like strengthening or enhancing or building from. So it recognizes you're building from a base of experience or knowledge. Or something about like applying this information to X practice. So it's again more additive than subtractive. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, cool. Anyone else? Get into some of the designy stuff. These are not all of the design considerations, but 5 key areas of considerations to keep in mind as you're designing an infographic, a poster. Doesn't have to, these considerations apply to all kinds of designs, not just infographics, but again, today purpose is infographics. Starting with some basic design principles. There's lots of information on design principles online. I've pulled the ones that I think are most relevant to poster design. I'm going to go through each one of them and use one of my old posters as an example. It's easier for me to kind of pick things apart and analyze it when it's my own work rather than critiquing someone else's. So, and in that way, I invite you to also critique and think about how you might have done things differently as well. And the goal with this section is just to emphasize by applying these design principles thoughtfully, you can hopefully design visual materials that are more powerful and visually engaging and help you tell a story. So this, you won't be able to see the text, obviously, but this was for a research poster competition. So it was a traditional, more academic audience, but it was for ArcticNet, which is a conference that brings together not only researchers, but community leads on research teams and other like policymakers as well from across the North, doing research across the North. So this was for part of my PhD project. I did it, this might have been 8 or so years ago now. So I probably would make different decisions now, but I thought it would be a good example to use for this this purpose because again, it was for a research poster competition. With that context in mind, I'm going to talk about contrast. So thinking about contrast to create visual excitement, highlight important elements of your poster. And that can be created with color, shape, size, or texture. And so I've just done a little, there's a little graphic there. So just showing how you can use different strategies for creating contrast and thinking about, well, what is the purpose of me creating contrast? It is to highlight this element, or it is to balance the poster in a different way. So from what you can see of this poster, where can you see contrast? Yep, color differences for sure. The dark, like white background, dark shapes. There's a hand at the back. Yeah, yeah. Just the different kind of like look and feel, or the feel of the different elements within it. Yeah. Yeah, they're the smaller ones meant to be like this is the starting point leading to the end point, which is the larger one. So kind of helping to tell the story in that way of like starting and finishing. Additive. Yeah, so great work, everyone. Let's go into proximity. So that creates visual unity and can be used to group similar elements. So that can be connecting them through placement, color, text, and that's cut off. That's okay. So here, similar to color or contrast, proximity is within like the different elements of the piece. So in the introduction section, those 4 rectangles are close to each other. They're connected, they're united. And then similarly, like for the method section, that's all close together as well. So it helps to create a flow in a way by grouping things. So some of these considerations may seem intuitive, but what I've learned is by sometimes putting words to intuition, it helps me understand what I'm doing better. So I invite you to do the same and sometimes say the obvious things out loud. All right, so proximity space is also related, and that here that's like kind of more like traditional poster design, but thinking about the spacing between elements and where you're placing them on a page, it can also involve using negative space effectively and strategically. So here I've tried to balance the positive space, so the shapes that are used to illustrate each section of the research with the negative space in the background to avoid the poster looking too cluttered. It still is cluttered. It is a research poster. It still needed to be a little bit familiar in the context, but tried to do it in a way that was maybe new and engaging. There are lots of different design, like even just PowerPoint using the grids and guides that they give you is really helpful in thinking about how you're spacing things out and making sure that the spacing is even and makes sense for your poster. So yeah, that's a little bit about space. Balance is something, so it is created through a lot of the other different elements that I've mentioned so far. And involves creating a visual structure, harmony, or clear counterparts as well. You can use balance to create contrast, if that makes sense. And you also use contrast to create balance. So these are all really connected. They can be symmetrical, asymmetrical, or radial. Here, I'm not really sure. I think maybe I would go for radial. I have the largest pin here that is intending on being my central point. So everything else is kind of like leading into that. So I would encourage you when you're designing your own posters to think about what the key element is of your story that you want to highlight, and then try to play around with balance and other design considerations to think about how you want to highlight that. Any questions about balance so far? Any other ideas for how balance was created in this poster? To repetition. Repetition is a consideration that can add consistency and facilitate a flow of information. Anyone identify any areas of repetition here? And don't be afraid to say if they're obvious, because that usually is the answer I'm looking for anyway. Blue boxes, yep. You're muttering.
That is you might maybe go for a maybe keep the blue but a little bit light blue.
Yep.
At the result part.
Yep.
And then, or maybe if the introduction is not like, if you want to highlight most in the introduction, you can use the bright blue for the introduction, but you make it tan blue for the result part. And
Yeah.
which one you want to highlight more.
Yeah, so that's more like contrast, right? That you're talking about. Yeah, yeah.
It can help you to avoid repetition in that case if you're not
For sure.
willing to.
Yeah, like that's a good point, because sometimes you don't want it to be repetitive. You want to create more contrast here. So that's a good point. Playing around with those different elements can help achieve different goals within a design. The pins, yeah. So even just like consistent shapes, things like that. The tree line on the top, like that's kind of like creating a repetitive flow across. Again, going back to contrast, that creates texture because it's more of it's a photo, and the rest of it is more graphic. But yeah, so repetitive. Jean.
I don't know if you mentioned, but standing back, there's an awful lot of white space
Mhm.
and an awful lot of small fonts.
Mhm.
You know, you better utilize that white space and make
Yeah.
some of your text larger.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And this, I forget how big this was, but it was had to fit on like a large poster board, and a lot of people were like this close to it when they were looking at it. So maybe not the best for this purpose, but that is a really good consideration. If it is not meant to be printed on a large scale format, you don't want to use tiny text. Alignment. So this is really important, similar to like space, proximity, thinking about what elements are close together and how they're aligned. That can create connections between shapes. So maybe I'll state the obvious, aligning the introduction boxes and the implications boxes. They're very clearly in a line. Everything else, like the data finding section, that's a more organic flow. So thinking about non-linear alignments as well, like yes, there's a line there, but it's not like immediately like reading right to left or left to right, or top to bottom. So playing around with the way that you align things, and then also thinking about utilizing your negative space effectively within the alignment that you're choosing as well. Color is a fun one. So that's usually I'm trying to choose colors that are associated with my subject matter. So this the blues and the greens, within the context of the Inuit community I was working with in Labrador, these are very common feels, just aesthetically when you're there in the environment. So wanting to replicate that in the poster was the goal. So usually I choose like 3-ish colors and try to stick within that color palette. I've linked here, and you'll have the slides after, but I usually start with color palette tools online. I really like Adobe Color Wheel. You can upload photos if you have a photo from your research experience and extract colors from there. So you can, if you're using that photo in the poster, you can make sure that the colors match or look good with it. And you can also find inspiration for other kinds of color palettes too by typing in keywords in terms of like the feel you want the colors to create. I also set myself a time limit for stuff like that because I can get pretty absorbed. So anyway, there's lots of different color theory and things out there, but a lot of the time keeping it simple and starting with just a few colors that resonate is a good starting point. Similarly, typography is something I need to set myself a time limit for, because once I start looking at fonts and different combinations of them, I start questioning literally my whole existence. So for posters, for infographics, it's a little bit easier because I'm always wanting things to be clear and legible. But like Jean said, this is not very legible. But simple fonts, very clean lines, keeping things like that simple so that the graphic elements can stand out is usually where I like to go. So you're not distracted by like fancy text or whatever. Like it helps to highlight the story in a better way. So tools that you can use, I mean, usually for like a research poster, fonts like Arial, Times New Roman, Helvetica, like maybe not Times New Roman. I usually stick to fonts that don't have the serifs, so sans serif fonts. But I'm getting now too in the weeds. So anyway, there's lots of resources online available to help with selecting fonts that look good together as well. So usually, again, I stick to maybe two, one for headings, one for body text. That keeps it very it's less distracting, I guess, that way. So have fun with exploring different fonts and combining them together. I should also say too, like thinking about your audience and if you're designing like something for a specific, like if you're University of Guelph branded poster or something like that, should probably use University of Guelph fonts. So considerations like that sometimes make decisions easier in the long run. So that's a very, very quick overview of design principles. There's lots more I could say and lots more I will say about that if you do have questions. But moving into balancing visuals with text, which is kind of the meat of designing an infographic, at least for me. I usually start with this by thinking about what can visuals do that words can't. And likewise, when would words or text and additional content be needed to provide framing for a visual? So really, you want them both to work to their strengths in the poster. They should work together to communicate the key message and letting them both shine, I guess, in a way. Easier said than done, and often requires a lot of drafts. And once you start, like you could, usually when I'm sketching and starting a design, I think I have all the words I need, or like I have what I need, but then I go to put it in a design and it doesn't fit or it doesn't look good. So you have to kind of go back and forth and play around with between the design and the visual or the starting point, whatever that is, if it's a sketch or if it's a Word doc or something like that. So it's a process. This is an example of something that is too text heavy. And again, it's more of like a list of facts. It's a nicely organized table and not really an infographic, if that makes sense. It's not really telling me a story. It's listing something, which maybe is the story that they want to tell, which is fine. But this is, there's some icons that have been included, but it's not really bringing you in, and they're not really letting the like textual and visual elements work together. And this one is one that's a little bit more visual heavy. There's a lot of data presented and there's not a lot of context for it. So there's no real headings or starting point or title. Maybe for the audience that this was intended for, this would make sense. But for this purpose, I just wanted to contrast something that was very written forward and something that was more kind of data visual forward. Combining the best of both is usually the direction you want to go. And that leads me into thinking about how to choose the right format for your data. Probably a lot of you are coming from different disciplines, different areas, quantitative, qualitative, all that, and all that's within each of them. So you probably already know that certain charts and figures work better than others for representing certain data. And ultimately, you want to focus on the story rather than the details for an infographic. So you're maybe going to create a simplified or condensed version of a graph or a graphic for a poster rather than the entire thing with all of the context around it, like highlighting the key information that you can glean from it. Not all data are numbers as well. So I mean, I come from a qualitative background, so I'm used to working with qualitative data, but have had to learn a lot about how to represent quantitative data effectively as well. And essentially, the visuals that you use, the charts that you use should help interpret the meaning of the data, not just the numbers. So you don't want to make your audience work. So yes, maybe you're representing or sharing a full graph on your poster. Well, what text elements then can you put around it? What heading can you use to describe like why that graph is there, what purpose it's serving, and how it relates to the key message. So with all of these considerations, going back to key message and audience again and again is really, really important. This is a chart you won't be able to see on this screen, but it will be provided in the slides after. And it's just there's many flowcharts like this available if you search for them, but this was one that I liked. It was organized under like the questions that you might ask based on like what data you're starting with, and following the different questions and answers will help lead you to hopefully the type of graph or chart or figure you might want to work with. So I think, yeah, like you all might know, like a pie chart doesn't do the same thing as a bar chart and all those very obvious things, but sometimes I know that like I've ran into this in the past where I'm like, oh, like this kind of chart would look really nice here. It would like a circular pie chart would look so great on this poster. But a pie chart is not actually the best way of sharing that data. So wanting to really like stay true to the story that you're telling, while also hopefully balancing aesthetic appeal, but keeping the aesthetics to the end is usually the best strategy, at least for me. Accessibility is another like massive topic that I won't be able to go into too much depth here. But along the side, I mean, all the examples I've shown too, they're not very accessible on the screen because they're far away. The contrast probably isn't great. But when you're working, thinking about things like balancing your text to graphics, having a logical flow of ideas, not making eyes jump around if they don't have to, if that's not part of your intentional flow of your poster, not making things too cluttered, but also not leaving really awkward gaps if they're not intentional. Too many blank spaces. So this is something with text justification that I like to focus on. I don't like full justified text, and often that's a big no for accessibility because it creates those pools of space between words trying to fit. Like it looks nice from far away because the words will fit in a perfect square or rectangle, but accessibility wise, it doesn't. It's not intuitive. You're not looking for like a newspaper column. You're wanting something to be easy to read. So left justified, center justified, right justified, those are all great. Full justified, avoid it. You don't want text too big. So this is a good example. Like, why is that number so big? It doesn't need to be that big. Aesthetically, it looks nice. So I put it there and I had a lot of space on the slide. So, but on a poster where you could use that valuable space for something else, thinking about making that smaller if it doesn't have to be big. You won't be able to see this, and that's intentional, clashing colors or not enough contrast of colors. There's, I think in the resources I've included, there's lots of accessibility tools you can use to put in the color codes that you have that from your document or file, and it'll tell you whether or not the clash is accessible, or the contrast between those colors is accessible. And hopefully you're avoiding clashing colors in the beginning because you've started with the color wheel and found colors that look good together. Also, too many different fonts or illegible fonts, going back to typography considerations, keeping it simple, focusing on less is more. And then also emphasis on too many things. So that's both in the messaging. So going back to your key message, you don't want to have too many conflicting and competing messages, but you also don't want to have too much. You don't want to, if everything's contrasting, then nothing fits together too. So thinking about what is the story, what is the key message, how can I use design elements to tell that story? That's a good opportunity to take a step back and think about those things. Oh yeah, so that's the takeaway. Can improve comprehension, enhance engagement, and ultimately build trust and respect. Approaching your audience with dignity, acknowledging where they're coming from and what knowledge they're bringing, and thinking about, again, if you're coming from a research context, research has a reputation for being very hierarchical and exclusionary. So thinking about ways of making your research accessible in not just the design, but also in the content and in the what you're trying to do with that research as well. I know I'm asking a lot of posters, but I promise these are all really important things that really are effective in the long run when it comes to making connections, building relationships. If you're standing beside a poster, you want to be proud of it and you want to be able to talk with people about it. So thinking about how you can use accessibility considerations in your poster designs it's one kind of part of that larger strategy. This is an example I like to share for related to accessibility considerations. This is not one of my infographics. It's from Pixels and Plans, which is a really great website. They have a lot of cool data visualizations, and I'll link. I linked to them here. I'm just going to read a quote from their website about why they chose this infographic or chose how to design it. Once in a while, clients post challenges that initiate an exciting approach to existing design methodologies. In this design, all the work needed to be done using only black and white because the resulting infographics needed to be printed in areas with no access to colored ink. So again, that's an accessibility consideration. If you're designing something in full color, but when you go to print it and it's in black and white, the colors don't actually translate, or you don't get the same contrast that you would with a color printer, that's a big flag for accessibility. So thinking about challenges like that as an opportunity rather than a challenge will allow for very creative designs to happen. I take this advice from multiple different fields, but especially in creative fields, creativity thrives under constraint. And that's not the best framing because I don't want to seem like it's limiting, but it's more just like, okay, here are the guardrails for where I'm working within, and how can I make something within that boundary that works, and that is maybe different than what I thought it could be in the first place. So accessibility, opportunity for creativity, and relatability, I would say. And that, in a way, relates to finding and creating that right tone. So when you're thinking about how to make something accessible, what tone are you going to use to be relatable, to be accessible? Thinking about images, drawings, fonts, color choices, symbols, and layouts. It all comes back to knowing that audience, knowing who they are, and knowing what they're used to. All of the components that I've mentioned up until this point about design considerations feed into creating that tone. And sometimes the best way to know that is just to ask questions. So whether or not you're, working on a collaborative project with a bunch of other people, or someone who's been to this conference before and they know kind of the vibe, they can help inform you about how to design a poster more effectively. So more questions will only help you in the long run, I think. Any questions about design considerations? You're all professionals now, I hope. Yeah.
Color wheels and stuff, something that a colleague of mine brings up sometimes, and I had never thought about it before, was like, when you have graphs, like for color blindness and stuff like that some color combinations are not distinguishable.
Yeah.
Do some of those color wheels and stuff like point out something?
Yeah.
Too, like when you're doing like a bar chart or something like that, like in terms of color selection, like which,
Yes.
you know what I mean?
Yes, I totally, yeah, and I had that come up in a project recently. And there are online tools that you can use to just plug in all the colors or like it'll simulate the different kinds of color blindness that might occur. And so you can see what your design would look like in those different simulations, and it'll help inform the colors you choose. And I forget, I think I might have included this in the resources, but there's one color palette creation tool that's specifically for like data visualizations, like for charts and things like that. So it'll give you enough contrast between like the different bars or the different points on a graph. And it kind of does that work for you. And mind you, like a lot of that experience was before like ChatGPT and AI. So I'm sure there's lots of tools now that do that work better than what I've scrapped together in the past. But long answer to your question, but yes, there's lots of tools and resources out there for those kinds of considerations. Any other questions?
Not a question, but a comment.
Yeah.
In fact, and not a lot of this also will apply to presentations
Mhm.
you do as well. That, I think of the typing, the different fonts and stuff, and how don't use the full justification. And that goes for so much.
Yeah.
That should be a tool that's thrown out, because it does make it hard.
I know, I don't know why they still have it. Yeah.
And one other thing, visuals that are appropriate. I often think of a presentation I watched one time, and it was with a group of farmers, and the research was really good and sound, but she started off with a presentation with a picture of a tractor on her presentation. It was a John Deere lawn tractor. And she was dealing with a bunch of farmers who automatically went, this researcher doesn't know what she's talking about.
Mhm.
And she lost the whole audience.
Mhm. Yep, that happens.
Yeah, it's really important to know your audience.
Yeah, it's even in my work, like using illustrations of different like Arctic animals and things like that. Okay, like that seal doesn't have that kind of marking. Like, why would you do that? Like, so it knowing the context is really important, and knowing what imagery and kind of elements would be familiar, because it can make you look really bad if you don't. And it also makes the research look bad too. So it adds an element of care, I think, when you do that extra work and think about what your audience is coming from and where you're coming into, and it puts you in the position of like, I'm here to learn with you, and I'm not coming down and telling you this is my research and you must listen. It's more like, here's how we could build this knowledge and make better decisions and solve the world's problems together. Thanks, Jean. My sample design process, I'm going to go through really quickly, and then I'll go into some examples of infographics. I think we're almost out of time. Yeah.
It's 11:42.
Okay, cool. So I will go quickly through the design process, and the examples I think will be helpful to look at on your own as well, just for inspiration. They're not all like A+ examples, but I think they all get to the point of what they're trying to do. So for me, this is usually, again, this is pretty linear, but I tried to make it as straightforward as possible. When I'm designing a poster, presentation, again, this applies across contexts. I start with gathering background info. I meet with any collaborators if I have them and ask those key questions about message, audience, goals for the end product. And then I step back from that conversation, develop the story, create a rough sketch, share that. If I'm working with someone, I share it with them. If I am working with myself, I just look at it. And I think about what I could do differently. I'm not even at the computer at this stage. I'm just sketching. And that takes away the pressure of making it look good, which I always need to remind myself to do through this process because I'm focusing on the story, not the look at this point. Then I incorporate feedback, whether that's from myself or from my collaborators. And then not until like this last kind of stage is where I'm actually designing things. And then I'm going back and reflecting, and then I'm refining, and then hopefully it's at an end product that's everyone feels good about sharing. So everyone's process is very different. This is mine. It just helps me focus and focus on the right things at the right time. For example, this is actually a student-led project in their community partner was Elric. From a couple of years ago. It was a university class here. A couple of you are in that class now. And they partnered with Elric and they were challenged with a research question, and they came up with a project and solution. And my role at the end was to come in and talk to the group about what they did and why they did it, and create an infographic that summarized and told the story. So this was the starting point. We had a conversation, and I sketched it out and organized it in a way that reflected what I heard. And then I shared it with that student group, and they gave me feedback about language and flow and everything like that, gave me color ideas and inspiration that way. And that ended up becoming this. So again, the text is really small. This was a large poster, but the poster was about livestock or extension, and the focus was kind of on identifying practical and relevant research needs, and that was the highlight at the bottom here. So you can look more at this in detail in the slides after, but just to show that like the starting point for these things is not pretty, but it is effective because it ends up being something that people can stand behind and be like, oh, I actually know the whole story behind this, and I can talk to it, and I can use it as a tool for facilitating deeper conversation. I want to leave you with these points. There's no right way to design an infographic, a poster, presentation, anything. Putting yourself in your audience's place is really key. And simplifying but maintaining accuracy is a fine line that I walk a lot. And it's never straightforward. Lots of edits and lots of back and forth usually happen along the way. But that's where, you can rely on other people's knowledge and contributions to support and guide, whether that's your research lab, your supervisor, any research collaborators, peers. There's lots that can be accomplished in asking those kinds of questions to different folks. Also, inspiration can come from anywhere, whether that's the Adobe color wheel, that's photos that you've taken, conversations you've had along the way. Keeping all of that in mind as you're designing is really important. So because we're out of time, I won't go through all of the examples with you, but there are many types of layouts you could use when designing your posters or infographic style posters. I've condensed it into these 4 general areas. A lot of them have crossover and they don't fit neatly into each of the categories, but it'll give you a good starting point to think about okay, my research is more like it would be really conducive to a timeline format or a process format, something like that. So I'll just flip through them now. And these slides just indicate like, use this format when. This was one from the Infographics in Practice program. So they're simplifying a sequence of events. And in this one, it's the boosting the sow microbiome with probiotics and postbiotics, and it's going through the timeline of like when the infection occurs and going through from sow to offspring. So it's a process, but it's also kind of a timeline because it illustrates a sequence. This is a more straightforward timeline that illustrates a progression over time. So that's another really important thing to think about. Timelines can also help to visually connect the dots with like something important that's happened, like a new virus being identified and moving through the different steps in that process to illustrate and connect dots of like when events happened simultaneously, things like that. Comparisons, again, pretty straightforward. This one has used color, indicating a previous situation and a current situation. Very clear about the differences between the two scenarios. This is also one from the Infographics in Practice program that is a great example of a comparison in helping make decisions about or reducing nutrient runoff. So here, the practices that influence high fertilizer runoff are red, low fertilizer runoff are green. So it's very clear about like, yes, no, this is good, this is not good. Data-driven, pretty straightforward, but it's helping to organize large amounts of information. These are the ones that a lot of people might be more familiar with that kind of just illustrate a lot of different graphs and points, but they can also tell a visually engaging story. So there's not a lot of like quantitative data here, but it's data about the unsung heroes, the flower flies, and what value they can bring to gardens. And this was an infographic design for community gardeners. So the audience was different than a traditional research audience. And it's telling a very visually engaging story with data, demonstrating trends and distributions. And the last one, processes. So something that is trying to provide step-by-step guidance. So this is stopping ASF spread. This one was from the Infographics in Practice program about how climate change increases food contamination. So illustrating a very complex process, but in a way that makes it more accessible to understand just by looking at it. You can also use it to explain how something works. So how integrating crops and livestock can work on a farm. I'm sorry for going over time, but these are the key takeaways.